everybody, to Faerie Aerie, a Chase's Place podcast. I'm your one and only single host, Chase Carroll, and today we are joined with three special guests. Hello and welcome. Today we will be talking about the Vendilion Clique, how the fairies of Lorwyn relate to how we self-select groups in the real world, and of course, this is my first time doing this podcast that is completely mine and nobody else's. Please introduce yourselves.
My name is Joe Redemann. You can find me on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn.
And I'm Hobbes Q. I can be found on Twitter at Hobbes Q.
And I'm Alex Newman. I can be found on Twitter at Alexander Newm.
Thanks for having us on, Chase.
Yeah, no problem. My Twitter handle is Mana Curves. Today we're talking about the only creature type that matters in Magic. We're talking about fairies today. So
yeah, I mean, we've been excited. I've been wanting to talk about fairies, my favorite tribe. I feel they're underrepresented in Magic. I feel like they don't get the respect that other tribes get. We've seen a lot of fairies.
We've seen a lot of fairies in Magic lore and story over the years, and I don't feel like they ever really get their due. They're shown as like really stupid and conniving, and I don't think that's fair to them.
Yeah,
I think that's really rude, because we believe that fairies can be so much more.
Thank you. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
So, I love fairies. That's a thing that I think none of you know about at all whatsoever. But it's true. In fact, I don't get mail that instead of my last name, it just says Fairy Queen on there. No, I don't. Never had. And it's fine. It's whatever. That's my thing. That's my shtick. That's my steez, my style and ease. I like fairies.
Your brand. #brand.
It is my brand. I did not know it was my brand until somebody one day said, "That's your brand." And I went, you know what? We're Nike. I got a Nike dealership. It's going to be great.
Fairies, just do it.
See it.
I'm fairly certain.
You're going to like
it. Fairly.
Yep, that's it. That's good.
It's going to be a long night, baby.
I can't help it. I guess that's just my pixie shtick. Get it? Like candy, but...
I'm just hoping that this can really bitterly blossom into something a little more productive.
I love it.
Yeah. So you always at the beginning of episodes you like to do that question, right?
Circular knowledge or deep analysis or something.
I think that's what it was.
I like to usually post a selfie and have you guys rate it on a scale from 1 to 10. But, I always rate myself a 10. But I guess since you asked about a question, we could possibly do that. I'm not really sure. This intro question that I'm completely making up off the top of my head and not reading out is, if there was a high school for the multiverse, which group of students would you find yourself in? And which characters in the lore would be there with you?
I'm Joe, and I think if I was at like a multiverse high school, when I was in at least a freshman in high school when I started, I really hung out with sort of the oddball kids, the goth kids, the sort of the stoner kids. It was kind of like a mishmash of everybody, but I also went to like an arts high school too, so everyone was kind of weird. They were like the weird, the metal kids too. So I just think I don't know, 2 of the main people, or I guess 3 of the main people that would probably be at my lunch table in the cafeteria would be like Chainer, Ixidor, and Braids probably.
Which version of Braids though?
That's a good question. Maybe both actually. They might both be there. Both OG straight up crazy Braids, and then plainer chaos version where she's still a little bit loopy, weird, distant, but not I'm gonna just kill everything.
Yeah, she's still hugging the whole group.
Right.
Yeah.
I also appreciate how you stuck in the good fairy colors there.
Oh yes.
Oh. Yeah. So so this is Hobbes Q. I'm going to talk about the slight difference between me as a freshman versus me as a sophomore. And I'll start with me as a sophomore. So me as a sophomore was somebody who had discovered that he could actually do something athletic for the first time in his life at somewhere around 5 foot and 90 something pounds, which was run. So I had joined the cross country team. And so I'm thinking all those long distance runners in Magic are who would be at my table. So I'm thinking Norn the Wary. I'm thinking probably Squee. That is like my lunch group. And to be fair, I'm lucky to be in this lunch group because as a freshman, my lunch table was me. And you know who used to throw things at me during lunch? Squee and Norn the Wary. That is the cross-country team that I joined used to throw things at me when I sat by my locker by myself at lunch as a freshman.
I go straight for the legs.
I go straight for the legs. I've done it before. I'll do it again. I did. I fought for my roommate's honor. I did.
I can't think of an elegant way to sidestep that comment, so I'm going to point it out and then make a sidestep. So I started answering the question of what group I would hang out with in high school, and then I realized I was actually answering a different question. So what I was, as a quick thing in high school, I was in a special magnet program within my school because I went to a public school, but it was a math, science, technology specific program. So I was with a lot of smart people. So I think that's where my first instinct was to go with Tamio, someone who knows a lot. She's got a lot of history and stories. And then for some reason, the next person I thought of was like Gideon, because he seems very jockish, but also he seems like the kind of jock who would really enjoy playing D&D. And that's when I realized I was just making a D&D group because that's what I did in high school. So going from there, like Teo, I think would definitely be in that group because he'd be like the brand new player who's really passionate about it. And, you know, we have to like teach him the rules and sometimes like bring that passion down a little bit and help him to channel that. I thought Squee would be a good contributor. Like he's the kind of guy who he's got a lot of experience. He tends to do goofy things so you forget it, but he has a lot of experience. And so sometimes he can make that goofy stuff work out. And then kind of going from there, I realized that there is actually a Dungeon Master printed Magic card. So that just seems super appropriate. Mm-hmm. It was some weird promotional thing that was printed. There's only a few copies of it. And then the last thing I have is someone who we would have kicked out of our group, and that's Urza. He's kind of like, I figured Urza would be like the power gamer who just imbalanced the game or would kind of do like really shady things that would get the group in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think we'd have kicked Urza out.
So do you think Urza would have been the bard? Alrighty, and my answer is weird. This is Chase speaking, in case you didn't know, just bringing you back around here. My answer is a weird one. So please don't judge me for this because I did not think of specific characters. I thought of cards and creature types. So the first thing that came to mind was Gilderbairn. Yeah, exactly. That creepy little dude. So fun fact, my high school experience, it's something else. I was weird. I was like the comic book person. If you actually, my high school did like senior pictures, and they are on the wall framed of our entire graduating class, and everyone else's is like, oh, we're at a fountain. Oh, we're in the forest. And mine, I'm covered in comic books. Like I'm covered in comic books. That is my picture. So I was a weirdo. So for me, I would hang out with Gilderbairn. For creature types, I'd hang out with Noggles, the weird little donkey people from Lorwyn, because, you know, they're weird and I'm weird. And then for a magic card specifically, I would be with a crumpled up magic card, like one that you rolled over with your chair and you forgot about, and then you find it and you're like, oh God, is this still sleeve playable? And there's creases in it. And people make fun of you for having it, but you like traded it for like $5 and it's like no big deal, but like to them it's a big deal.
Are you talking about yourself or the card? I'm horrible with metaphors. Both. Really bad.
Both.
So if I can, if you don't mind me jumping in, the reason we're talking about groups that we would hang out with while we're talking about fairies is because, you know, we're talking about cliques, y'all. We're talking about cliques, the Lorwyn groups of fairies. And I am so excited. This is like we've all been saying, they're our favorite creature type. And so, I mean, talking about the socio-political hierarchy of the Fae of Lorwyn, that's right up our alley.
I think it's fantastic, and I'm really happy that you decided to come on to my show, and only my show that I have had for years now, even though this is my first episode, to do this with me. I do have to say, though, that I think it's very fantastic that we are indeed talking about fairies. And, we're for Eldraine, which we accidentally predicted, by the way. We were actually, mulling this over in our head for weeks. I also think it'd be very cool that if we could write Wizards of the Coast, I know that they've had this set planned for years, but that in Eldraine there should be a war between fairies and goblins, and the far superior creature type fairies would definitely win, I think.
I mean,
And
let's
kill
be honest,
goblins and
goblins-
specifically wear their skin.
They have no chance. I mean, you just talked about the greatest, most underrated tribe, Faerie,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
the worst tribe
Yes.
that they could have just gotten rid of when they did the whole, like when they did that creature type removal. Why didn't they just get rid of it?
Yeah.
Why didn't they
Why?
just make them wingless fairies or something?
Wingless
Yeah.
fairies, right?
Yeah.
Like fairies that don't fly. It could even say
Yeah.
that in the type, and I would have been fine. I would have been fine.
I'm fairly certain you guys are going to get along with me. With fairies, I know that we had our intro question. Now we're going to get into fairies in general. There are fairies on many different planes in Magic, but the one that I like to focus on heavily and completely ignore the others, Lorwyn. Because there's fairies. There was fairies in Ice Age. There was fairies in Dominaria, although there weren't any cards printed for that. There's fairies in Ravnica, and that's cool and dandy and well. But I like to talk about the fairies specifically in Lorwyn because they are in Lorwyn. You see fairies be very social, and that's not something that you see in any of the other sets. Whereas in Ravnica, you see fairies be sort of used for spy techniques or for surveillance. Even when they were for wee Dragonauts, they were still used for surveillance. Metropolis Sprite, all those fairies like that, they were all used for surveillance. Guildpact Informant, the one that was printed in the Jace dual deck, well, not dual deck, the Jace Planeswalker deck, was also used as an informant. So I feel like the Lorwyn fairies have a more social context that we don't see anywhere else in Magic, which is why I'm so excited for Eldraine.
Yeah. And that's a thing too, is there is, like you're saying, there's a social element. There's like the fairies exist on more than one level of the hierarchy in Lorwyn too. There's Queen Oona, of course, who we'll get to in a bit. But then there are the fairies that serve her, and then there are fairies below them, and so there is this like complex social structure in addition. Whereas, like you're saying, I mean, the Ravnica fairies are just sort of toadies for the guild leaders, on Ravnica.
Mm-hmm. And the fairies have a lot bigger footprint in Lorwyn. They really didn't get a lot of focus in any of the other sets and worlds that they're in. And hopefully with Eldraine, we're going to see another take on fairies, another world where they're a major portion of it as opposed to little side notes.
Yes.
Right, and to the point, sorry, just to add on to that, to the point where we don't even know, I can't remember now what the names are, but the brother and sister Ravnica fairies, the Izzet ones, we don't even have any lore for them.
Oh, Tibor and
Lumia.
Lumia.
Yeah, we don't even have any actual lore behind them. So there's just, I mean, yes, we have a legendary from them, but we don't know what they are.
When it comes to fairies, I feel like, it's kind of obviously as to what they are. But fairies are pretty much just like humanoid little looking creatures. They're very itty bitty, teeny tiny. The dominant plane that we're talking about is Lorwyn. And on Lorwyn, I think one of my favorite things about them is that the bugs on Lorwyn, they look like bugs. They're very insect-like. And I think that's very different from the traditional fairies that you see in Ravnica, where they're more like human. They have regular eyes instead of like slanted bug eyes, no antenna, no weird looking mandibles or grasshopper legs. And I think that's very interesting. And what kind of drew me to them in the first place. But one thing I think that's really interesting about the Lorwyn Fae is what we kind of like hinted at with our intro question, which is cliques. The fact that fairies hang out in around of groups of 3 to 5, and kind of those are their like set group of people. Even though they are all ruled under Oona, they still have a sort of tight knit connection with one another in cliques.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing too is sort of the like as we're talking about the clique elements. A lot of what they do in those cliques is like harvesting dreams for Oona. And I found this really interesting when we were doing some background research. But the Fae of Lorwyn can't dream. That's wild. That is a weird little like tidbit behind them, that they don't have the ability to dream, and so that's why they go around stealing people's dreams. That's why you see the card, the very notable card in Modern, Thoughtseize, because they are trying to harvest those things so they can experience some of that.
It's actually not known if they dream or not. It is suspected that they cannot. They actually steal dreams from others, like you said, depicted in Thoughtseize, to use as energy, and they carry that around with them as sparkling energy that they give to Oona. They all serve. Not much is known about Oona, which I also think is very interesting. If we go back to our high school metaphor, Oona is kind of like, she's like Regina George. Una's Regina George, and everybody else is just like fiddling gossip to her, and the dreams are gossip. That kind of dates me as Mean Girls. But I think that it's very interesting that we see, even in Lorwyn, that Fae still, while they aren't informants, they do act sneakily, and they steal in a way that is very. They do it when you're asleep, obviously, but it's very unknown to the other creatures of Lorwyn. So fairies are still used as sort of, taking bits of information. When we look at the Dominaria Fae, they do also steal. There actually is one card that does depict a Dominaria Fae. It is an ugly, shriveled-looking, Schmeagol-looking thing. I can't remember the card for the life of me. It's a mono-black card. And actually, Dominaria Fae, well, they do steal. They steal teeth. They take teeth.
Oh,
and I think that's the tune we can all dance to.
The MTG Wiki article on fairies has that card, Divest.
Yes.
And the flavor text says, flitter sprites collect unusually valuable things. Coins of fallen empires, baby teeth, and memories of treasured names. And that's a really weird rule of 3 collection.
I like that rule of 3, but I also think it's interesting that even if they don't steal dreams, they do steal memories. And that I think kind of strings along the niche that Fae are put into as being sort of sneaky creatures. So I feel like really cool is kind of a couple quotes that we got from the wiki article. Stuff that I pretty much I like have memorized like the back of my hand. I love this creature type so much. So the Fae of Lorwyn lead short, flitting lives in the pursuit of gossip, diversions, and amusing intrigues. But fairies can also be carelessly cruel, capricious, and vindictive. It is thought that fairies do not dream, which would explain why they spend so much time harvesting the dreams of others. They can distill these stolen dreams into a sparkling energy that they carry around them. The fairies of Lorwyn were actually the only tribe to not be affected by the Great Aurora, which is a planar phenomenon that shifts between the light and the silly world of Lorwyn and the dark and dangerous one of Shadowmoor. And this is likely due to their harvesting of dream magic and their interventions of their queen, Oona.
So that's another thing too. You draw the parallel between Oona and Regina George, and Regina in Mean Girls is kind of that central hub of the high school's social world, and so everything rotates around her, and we see that too similarly with the Great Aurora. Like everything changes around the Fae. The Fae don't change.
Exactly. And when you kind of look, I know that I'm pulling very far out from magic here, but when you look at, for instance, like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, they said that Tinkerbell was so small that she could only feel one emotion at a time. And that emotion was often, jealousy or anger. And, we look at the Lorwyn Fae, and it's even said that they're cruel and capricious. The Fae aren't, they look cute and they're small, but they aren't pleasant little creatures, that like land on your finger and you go, like they're hateful little things. And I think
I thought that was a bluebird, not a fairy, even in Disney here. We're way off left field, but that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not though, right?
The Lorwyn Fae look like bugs, not necessarily birds, but still, it works.
Well, they're like eat your hand bugs too. They're not like land there and chill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're like the oh god, they're like that like 1 foot long wasp that like kills people. You know what I'm talking about? Like they're like you look at it and you're like, it's a bug. It's a bug. It's like it's not gonna touch me. But then the bug lands on you and you're like, oh, I'm dead. That's what I would say if I would die, by the way.
Best last words.
But when we look at fairies, I mean, they're so snobby, they're so mean, they're so spiteful, and I think that is really interesting because you either look at them as like being these cute little creatures, or you don't really see them as having much personality at all due to the lack of representation in magic because they're so
Underrated and better than goblins.
But I feel like one thing when we go with my Mean Girls reference that I said earlier is Wydwen, the biting gale, another legendary fairy who is not as interesting as Oona, unfortunately, but I still like her. She is actually described in magic lore as being like a mean girl. Like being like what she does is she's one of the fae that does not necessarily follow the clique rules, which is, groups of 3 to 6. Instead, she just kind of hops from one clique to the another, spreading gossip and spreading drama, and then leaving when she's done. So she really just sort of hops around and kind of talks shit about people and then flutters away. And that hurts. But that's not the part of what fairies are, is that, they look cute, but they steal and they talk shit. And I think that is so
They will stab you with their tiny pikes and their words.
Yeah, exactly. And guess what hurts more?
The word.
And I think that's an interesting comparison to like Tinkerbell and things, because it's showing at least the fairies of Lorwyn within magic are shown to have a greater depth of personality and emotions and things, even if a lot of the words in the list are more negative, cruel and capricious, but if they're doing gossip and they have these cliques and there's these amusing intrigues, to quote this article, it's showing that there's more than one emotion going on at a time. There's more going on there.
I also feel like it's important to say that a lot of people will look at fairies as a creature type and just sort of write them up as being very low powered, when that's not necessarily true when you look at the lore. For instance, Oona is, she's just an absolute boss. Her size, if you look at the art, even if you just look at the art of Oona, Queen of the Fae, you can look in the background, the small background, that they're teeny tiny little itty bitty fairies. She's full person size. She's a whole woman. And so I feel like it's also interesting because she caused the great auroras that pretty much transitioned Lorwyn to Shadowmoor. She creates and causes the great aurora and have the plane change around her. She's the master and everyone else are the puppets. And so she heavily impacts the plane. And the only reason that she was defeated by Marwyn, which we will talk about in a little bit, is because she, the great aurora that she normally creates and happens to kind of switch, Lorwyn from Shadowmoor, she didn't really count it on happening so soon. And so she pretty much just kind of made a copy of Marwyn, put all her thoughts and memories in there so that she would not be affected by the great aurora, because the original times that she caused it didn't affect her because she caused it, but this time she didn't cause it. I kind of messed up here. I pulled a Zeus. I don't really know what to do. And she ended up kind of getting a little cocky and got messed up and got defeated, leaving Marwyn to be leader of the Fae. So that is kind of where we see Oona's downfall. Her arrogance is because she was this big, powerful figure that shifts the entire plane. She affects the entire plane and literally changes the fabric of the plane from being light and happy to being dark and Grimm's fairy tales, original Grimm's fairy tales, where you like dance until you die and you get your eyes pecked out. She does that.
This is what we're hoping to get in Eldraine, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I want eyes picked out. I want to see some bloody feet. If you're not like having sex with a bear, it's not fairy tales. That is.
You referenced Zeus, and I was going to make a joke in that direction, but I thought it'd interrupt the flow. But yeah, kind of brought it back there.
I will
always bring it back there.
Bring it back, Daddy-O. One hop this time.
I think what I've learned too, though, from the fairy that we know of on Lorwyn, is I can see why Chase loves them so much. They just seem to really epitomize everything that she is about on Twitter that I've seen so far.
Yeah, capricious and vengeful, and
Yep. My mic seems to be. Can you guys? Can you hear me still?
I believe we've eliminated the target.
Anyway,
this has turned into a hostage situation. And welcome back.
Going forward with Chase and the other 2 guests.
Yes, indeed.
What was I gonna say before?
Sorry.
No. It's okay.
I'd totally been planning it, and I had to run upstairs again.
oh,
okay.
Hobbes, you're
So-
back. Wow, that's crazy that you've returned. Are you okay?
What I was gonna say is, so that's the big reason why Oona is defeated at the end. Oh God. The reason why Oona is defeated at the end isn't because she didn't plan enough. It's just because the timeline shifted. Like, she would have ruled Lorwyn Shadowmoor indefinitely until, if not for like Aisling speeding up the clock on the Great Aurora, and therefore, her kind of getting caught with her flower petals down, as it were.
I thought even Faerie Aerie was a family podcast show.
But like Oona it was not only the fact that Aisling did that, it was the fact that Una's arrogance got in the way of her. And we kind of see that with the Vendilion Clique, which is obviously, first of all, a very popular fairy card in general, blue legendary, famous clique by name. There's only a couple cliques like cards in Magic. You have Misfine, you have Knack, and you have Vendilion Clique. And the one that's played the most, talked about the most, and widely known the most is Vendilion Clique, which is made up of, I believe, 3 fairies or siblings, which I think is a little bit of lore that I think is very interesting, is that you don't get much information about the Fae, but you get that these Fae not only have names, but they're siblings. So you have Visa, Endry, and Ileona. And Ileona was the eldest, and Endry's the only brother. So you have, 2 sisters and a brother. And I just think that's very cool. Even just flat out, if you just gave me that tidbit, like a little taste of lore, that's all I need. I'm like, well, you got names? Love it. Yeah, but the fact that they're so cool, the fact that, a lot of people don't really, take the time to dig behind the lore. I mean, you guys do, and that's why I'm so happy that you're on my podcast. But there's the Lorwyn, Morningtide, Eventide, and Shadowmoor books, the novels that were printed a while ago that give you this detail not only about Marwyn, but about the Vendilion Clique and how they were instrumental in pretty much the downfall of Oona herself, which I think is very interesting.
Which is another thing, too, that I don't think she could have possibly planned for. Because I think the way she treats them and talks to them in those novels is like, sort of the classic, big bad boss, like, oh, idiot underling, you'll do this thing for me. And they're like, yeah, sure, okay. And then they start thinking for themselves, and all of a sudden it all falls apart.
Exactly. Pretty much just to kind of explain the lore behind the Vendilion Clique for,
You two that I obviously know you don't know,
but for everyone else who's listening. So the Vendilion Clique was one of the highest up cliques in the service of Oona. Pretty much she just kind of sent them out to do her bidding. That's what usually the cliques were, even though they were little friend groups. Oona was like, you over there, go out and do what I tell you to do. They pretty much carried messages for Oona, got people items, dreams, stuff that Oona needed that even today we still don't really know the function of it. We just know that she wanted them and needed it. So pretty much all 3 were pretty much kind of lent to Marlin of the Morn Song to kind of ensure that she was safe. But pretty much Marlin kind of had, like some side chats. She was like, like, blah, like, you guys are cool, blah, love you guys, blah. And pretty much they started to ally with Marlin, even though they were originally lent to Marlin by Oona. And so I see that we kind of see a shift in the Lorwyn Fae, specifically the Vendilion Clique, stopping the servitude and the theft and sort of thinking for themselves, which you don't really see. You just see them doing their bidding for Oona. Even on the Flavor Texas Secluded Glen, they they just were there for Oona, and they served Oona, and that was their purpose, was to serve Oona.
Yeah. And so we do see, like you were saying, after the Great Aurora shifts everything from Lorwyn to Shadowmoor specifically, Visa and Ileona stayed with Marlin, and they had started quarreling between the two of them a little bit, but Oona sort of reworked her magic over Visa and lured her back to the Fae. I'm sorry. They had started squabbling a bit. Oona reworked her magic over Visa, lured her back to the Fae Conclave, while Ileona stayed loyal to Marlin. While this had happened, Endry had completely split off to do other stuff for Oona, but then, you know, being that he was all on his own, he had already started to kind of go like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be doing this really awful, nasty stuff all the time. Maybe I should be, you know, a nice person. And then once Visa was pulled away, the clique was completely split, and we do see them really rapidly go from being kind of three facets of one sort of entity to being three very unique people. And that's a really interesting thing that, again, we don't see that a lot in the lore.
No, because fairies are usually in the lore just nameless, flittering beings doing only things for. There's only two fae that in Lorwyn that are named. If we ignore the Vendilion Clique, you have Wydwen and you have Oona, and so seeing how each of these fairies kind of split off and function and kind of find their own identities is very interesting and very weird to see, because that's not really something that's explored in any other lore with the magic. Whether you look at the Planet Ice Age, whether you look at Dominaria, you don't really see that. You just see them as just being sort of, hey, I'm a creature, I'm here.
Right.
And even then we see a shift in sort of the function of these fae. Pretty much when he returned to gather his sisters, he just laid them to rest and decided, even though fairies are, we don't know if they don't dream, but we can't say that for certain, but he laid to rest and with them and dreamt of his sisters. There's that abandonment of that call that Oona has over them, and sort of this individuality that we see kind of happen. There is a loyalty to the family of the Vendilion Clique, but only there that we see.
Yeah, and I thought it was cool too that, so as this, there's the very strict social hierarchy that the Fae have. Endry, in being sent off in his solo stuff while he left Visa and Ileona, he runs into a couple groups of groundlings. So those are fairies without wings, and they are treated basically as like the lowest of the low in the fairy hierarchy, like untouchables basically. And he starts
screw
to
those guys.
And there's actually interest. I had to search this on Scryfall just to see. There's only one card that references groundlings, and that's Groundling Pouncer from Eventide. And yeah, doesn't have flying, not depicted with wings. Very accurate. But it was interesting that he, once he was away from his normal context, he started making friends with these groundlings and sort of seeing like, hey, I'm not that different from you all. You're not that different from me. And he actually, in the final battle of the, Aurora, all that, he led a group of groundlings in an assault on Oona's stronghold. Mm-hmm. And actually, in that process, lost one of his own wings too. So again, we're seeing that sort of symbolic, sort of coming down from the perch that he'd been put on and sort of being this bridge between the two. I think that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, I mean, even on since you brought up the card, I mean, the Groundling Pouncer, the flavor text alone there just kind of shows you that. It says, Endry was determined to teach his groundlings a few winged fairy tricks. And so that kind of shows that, while he is utilizing them as an army, there is that sort of, being brought down and kind of being humbling himself to say, I'm not saying that he lost his wing on purpose by any means, but kind of losing that kind of, shows him that, he's just the same as they are, just one wing less. And I think that's something that's also very interesting. That kind of shows a humanized version of a fairy that's not capricious, that's not hateful, that cares.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we get a lot of that in fiction too. The cliques, the groups, that the people who hold themselves above, and then they get some experience with people who are different, and they have a bigger understanding of both themselves and the world as they get to know people who are outside of their group.
Right, absolutely. It's a really nice. Honestly, I think that's a really nice metaphor for the world today. Rather than like. There is something to be said about finding the people that you belong with and like sort of having a place to kind of come back to as a comfort zone all the time, like, your family, be it a blood related family or a self-selected family. And I guess this is branching a little bit into actionable advice here, but, but it's good to stretch beyond those bounds of these small cliques, these 3 to 5, 3 to 6 fairies in a way, and say like, okay, I'm going to find what makes me similar to you also, even though for whatever reason, the social context I'm in is telling me that I have to be different than you.
And if we also kind of bring that back to the Mean Girls references that I can't stop making, I mean, like in the movie, it's everything's like depicted as like a watering hole. Everybody's going crazy. It's a very weird, like, us versus them kind of thing. But when Regina George was hit by a bus, and put in that brace, she kind of got humbled, and Katie Heron, Lindsay Lohan, who essentially is Marlin in this metaphor I'm talking about, kind of takes over as Queen Bee or Queen of the Fae and kind of instills this new reign of, there's no cliques. Everyone's talking to each other. Everybody's, interacting, no more Danny DeVito, I love your work. It's everybody's just cool. And one thing I always think it's interesting to kind of look back because Oona isn't dead. And for a while, I thought that myself. I thought she had died. But no, she was just defeated. So she's actually still trying to gain her power back in order to retake over the Fae throne. And so I think that is something that's also interesting too, is that, like in my Mean Girls reference, Regina George actually became a nice person. But I don't think that we're going to be seeing that with Oona because she herself going back to this thing I keep repeating, the fairies are small, they can only feel so much. But they are capricious, hateful little beings. And imagine if you scaled it up to a 6 foot tall person that is nothing but hateful and capricious. I mean, she's literally just like, hello, you're basking in my glorious presence. It's me. I really honestly think that if we see Oona return, it's going to be a surprise, bitch, you thought you seen the last of me kind of moment. Like it's going to be one of those things where she's not going to be humble.
You best not miss.
Exactly. Like the only thing you're gonna catch are these hands.
These real creepy, buggy hands.
It's like her little like weird buggy. This is my little ASMR portion. It's
bug ASMR is not what I want.
It's okay. It's good. It's good. But we're not gonna see a redemption.
So I haven't read any of the Lorwyn books either. But hearing you two talk about these characters, I have maybe a weird analogy to draw to a pair of other characters from a completely different medium that has been in pop culture lately, and see how this analogy goes. So, in Avengers 2: Age of Ultron,
yeah.
You have Ultron, a little bit different than Oona because Ultron was created to protect the Earth and whatever, but tried to set himself up as like the ruler of everything. And then you have Vision, who is basically the mirror image of Ultron, and like Ultron, how he should have been. Mm-hmm. Does this feel like an analogy that has legs?
Yes. I don't know if you can see my face, but I'm like, that's a good metaphor.
Yes, 100%. That's very good.
Okay, good. Then I am fine.
honestly, if you really wanna draw comparisons, Age of Ultron, pretty much shot for shot remake of Mean Girls. Let's be honest, Ultron's a Regina.
So bringing it back in. So I also wanted to ask, while we're on this topic of like the group splitting apart, the Vendilion Clique splitting apart specifically, and we see each of them develop a lot more into individual characters. Entry in specific, we see a really well-developed arc, and I don't think it's any... We don't have to mince words here. I don't think it's any surprise that Endry is the one brother of the group, and so, of course, he gets the developed arc. But...
Yeah.
misogyny aside, I do want to know what you think, Chase, about that sort of narrative of we touched a little bit on it with talking about him breaking apart the hierarchy. Alex, you mentioned that sort of symbolic trope in literature, but I want to know, like, does it fit the story? Does Endry's sort of end of his arc make sense, and is that fitting? I guess and how can we take some of his story specifically, because we do see that full narrative path into a real world sort of application.
When I look at the story, I think it fits and it doesn't, and the reason why I think it fits is because even though yes that the only prominent male fairy is depicted as sort of having this overarching like thing, and he is kind of the final note that we see on the Vendilion Clique. I actually also think that the choice for that specifically was a good one, and the reason why I think is because when you look at fairies in and out of magic, they're just sort of typecasted as being very feminine sort of creatures. Everyone, you just look at them and you automatically assume, just like when you look at angels and you're like, God, there's a lot of like female angels and there's only two angels that are men. Like, it's very interesting to see, the only, named sort of fairy that's, a guy, have this sort of arc and have, this emotional, not roller coaster, but this emotional, like, from point A to point B. And I think that's very interesting because, as much as I love fairies, they do obviously, they're kind of like, oh, they're really bad creature types. Of course you like fairies, your girl, stuff like that. So I think that they're typecasted as being sort of feminine. And so I feel like having that one brother have that, I think, is interesting. Now, the way it ends, I think it's kind of poetic because, fairies, may or may not dream. We don't know, but for lore's sake, people just assume they don't. And so the fact that he chooses to sleep in dream of his siblings, I think is very beautiful, because he and his sister sort of did all this bidding for Oona, never really doing anything for themselves, stealing other people's dreams, giving them to Oona, turning it into energy, not really having any for themselves. And so I think that not only does he want to have this experience that he might not be able to have at all, or can't even, experience, the fact that he decides to not only have it, but have it be about his family, I think is also something that's sort of beautiful and poetic. And I think that it's kind of, when we take that into a real world application, it just seems to me like it's, stop serving what you feel like you should serve and serve what feels good for you, sort of like that, like I'm like, if we take it back to that sort of like high school metaphor that we've been talking about, stop really like doing what other people will tell you because it's cool, or because people say it's cool, or because of peer pressure. You do what you want to do because it's good for you, or because it makes you happy. And so we see that sort of shift for him, that I'm going to stop serving like this big boss, this mean girl, and be with my family. And he not only does it for the experience of dreaming, but does it because it's his choice. And I think that's something that is interesting, to say the least. It seems like it's right and also odd at the same time. It's like,
yeah,
I don't know, it's a very weird sort of way to end it out, because he can wake up, but he chooses to be dormant.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good lesson to get the don't be what you're supposed to be who you are, which, because I speak in pop culture references and metaphors, that goes to Endgame. Marvel's Endgame. Like, and that was with, there's an entire discussion about Thor's character in that movie, but one of the lines that has stuck with me was when his mom said to him, "Don't be what you're supposed to be who you are." And that is I like seeing that message whenever and however often we can get that in pop culture. It's very important to have that for people, both because the repetition is helpful for those of us who've heard it, and also because something that those of us who are a little older tend to forget when new movies come out and you say, well, this is just this other movie retold. It's like, yes, but new generations need to have some of these same stories. We've been telling the same stories, some of the same stories, for hundreds and thousands of years, because there's fundamental elements to these stories that are important to us and to our cultures and to transmitting these messages.
Yeah, and I think too, it's that we keep telling it because it's still not gotten better. Like that's sort of one theory of like folk and fairy tales while we're talking about it, but that they keep being passed on, because they're primarily through oral tradition. Like it's not just handing a illustrated storybook to your kids and going, here, read this. Like we tell the stories of whatever, of Snow White or of Rumpelstiltskin or all of these sort of seminal fairy tales. We tell them because something in there is important and it still hasn't gotten like ironed out. That's why morals are in those too. That's a theory, at least, of social sociology and fairy tales.
That's a fascinating idea that I have, like you saying that has just occurred to me, and that I haven't really thought through and would love to like try to research, but it would be like a life's work studying stories and how they change based on lessons that maybe we don't need anymore versus the lessons that we still do.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that whole oral tradition, and it adapts, that I'm sure that's
yeah. Actually, I minored in German in college, so we actually learned a little bit about this, and that within the certain areas of Germany, like the north and the south and the east and the west, the fairy tales would change a little bit depending on the culture in that part of Germany. And so there actually was a change in like the morals. There's actually, I believe that the Brothers Grimm actually, that was their goal, was to go around the different parts of Germany and gather up these tales that everyone was telling there, because they would be different in some places and similar in other places. And they actually have a full gigantic, I mean, just like massive, like page by page, like library in Germany of the different versions of these fairy tales that we see. And I mean, like, that's why they were changed when they came to to the United States, is because they were so harsh and different that we were like, God, like, this woman wronged her stepdaughter, so now she's gonna dance in burning coals. That's a little much. We're just gonna say that she's like hidden away, like,
right.
Or like, like Ursula's like, fine, she's in the bottom of the sea somewhere. I mean, like, we really don't see that that sort of like comeuppance, that like coming full circle that the German fairy tales originally did. And I feel like, circling back to Eldraine, we will see the original fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm dark fairy tales, as they were meant to be told, as they were originally told within Eldraine. I mean, we see that even in the art, like like the frightening looking gingerbread man, the person being baked in the pie. I definitely like the gruesome aspects of fairy tales that we often forget. I mean, even earlier, when, this is gonna sound funny, but like the having sex with a bear thing, that was actually a fairy tale that was told. It was called Rosenrot und Schneeweiß, and that was Rose Red and Snow White, not the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but pretty much it was just these two sisters who symbolized, who were the physical embodiments pretty much of just like, fall and like summer, like spring and summer, fall and winter. And they befriended this bear who was a chill dude. And there was a gnome somewhere in there who like tried to like, but there is like, the gnome just randomly shows up, is like, I have this treasure, and they're like, we want that treasure, and the gnome's like, I'm gonna kill you guys. Then the bear the gnome, and then they have sex with the bear, and then the bear is like, oh, I'm suddenly two princes now. Like he literally just like stops. Yeah, but like you can't just tell that to a 5-year-old nowadays.
Right.
But back then you could, and then they did, and like that's just like it's a very weird story, and all the stories are very weird. There's a shift to the morals that we tell in fairy tales that we see, suddenly brought up. And I think that we're seeing also that in magic, we're seeing the gruesome side of it too, that it's not just, oh, and then he fell away into a cavern. It's like, no, Nicol Bolas is floating in like Superman jail,
Right.
like the weird little glass going, whoop, 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 whoop. Like that's not a cool place to be. You have people dying, which happens. I mean, guaranteed, there have been a few deaths in Disney, only a couple of them depicted, being Bambi and Mufasa dying.
Right.
But
Non-human people.
yeah, non-human.
Right.
They really try to detach it, and I feel like we're gonna see a return to that sort of moral, dark, ambiguity that we see in fairy tales in Eldraine.
Well, and I agree with you, except for that one word of ambiguity, because I do think some of this this does wrap into what we're talking about with the fairies too. Is this fairy tales originally were used to instill a certain kind of social order or social morals. Thinking about like Little Red Riding Hood, Charles Perrault's version of it. At the end of the story, Little Red and the grandma both get eaten. There is no huntsman who saves them. They are just chomped up by the wolf. And the moral is little girls who let wolves in their parlors, and there's innuendo there, get what they deserve. And so it's all about like be chaste and also be afraid of strangers and also Chase.
That's my name. So
But it's all about like don't be a hoe and also be afraid of all the strangers around you. And like, it's trying to instill a certain kind of society. And I don't think so much that Wizards is going to try to do that, but I do think that they are no longer doing that sanitization thing. They are letting some of that grimier stuff happen and say like, here are ideas. Like, let's see what happens in this story when you put all these ideas in a space. And we see this with the fairies too, where there's a very strict social hierarchy. All of this kind of plays in together, where I think you do see these worlds we're getting now in Magic Story are really well defined. They have really maybe not good, but explicit social orders and dynamics, and that's super interesting to see. And I think what you're saying, Chase, exactly though, is in Eldraine they're gonna knock that up to 10 or 11, I guess.
I just think that not exploring that would be a waste, especially since they said it's going to be like a dark Brothers Grimm mixed with like Camelot, and I think that is very, very, very important, because when we look at stuff like the Canterbury Tales, when we look at the original Brothers Grimm, it's very dark. I mean, I honestly expect to see a little bit of like a drop of like Aesop in there, the moralistic Scorpion and the Frog kind of thing. And I think that is something that we're going to see depicted.
I want to ask, so Maro, yes, I was going to touch on this. Maro said that Eldraine is not going to have many fairies all over the place, but I do want to ask what, from both of you, what is your prediction of how fairies are going to play into the world of Eldraine or Hope?
For me, this is just me thinking about this every night at 3 a.m. while I lie awake in bed, hoping they get this from me. But when they first released the packaging, I actually made some predictions on Twitter. And one of the things I thought I would really like to see, we've already talked a little bit about the hierarchy and class hierarchy with fairies, specifically within Lorwyn. But I feel like this would be more like, like clothed fairies in gowns, like elite fairies, like the bourgeoisie fairies. I think that would be very interesting, because the fairies that we see are coated in armor with shields, and I mean there's even like the set symbol looks like a crest to me. So I really do want to see like some sort of like allegiance to a ruler of some sort, but not have it mimic what we had in Lorwyn, which is just sort of this ethereal being with fairy underlings. I want to see
like a fairy
class
court
structure. I want to see, fairy court class structure. Like a king, queen, elected official, what have you. I think that'd be interesting to see.
See, and I kind of going a little bit off of what you were talking about earlier, Chase. You were talking about kind of the niche that fairies fill in most of these worlds. Even Lorwyn, the one world where we really see them get a big space, is this, mostly sneaky, mostly used as, when they're used in other people's groups, they're infiltrators, or they're used for, espionage or scouts. And it's like, I would really like to see either a larger place for them or an exploration of a different niche, a different place where they fit into this world and the general order of the world.
Yeah.
Not just as like the informants and dealing with like being on the side, but finding somewhere that's more unique.
Yeah, and it's a topic that we haven't spoken about, but I know it's come up a lot in talks off air, talking about how different races play in different worlds, not play, but what roles they fill within the different worlds, and how your fairies are different in this world, or your goblins that probably shouldn't be printed in the game anymore, how they're different from this world to that world, and your merfolks, which are slightly more acceptable. Whatever you have, and many of those other races have been explored. Your goblins, your elves, your merfolk, those have been explored in different worlds and given different niches and wildly different art styles sometimes even. You look at merfolk in Mercadia versus your merfolk in like Dominaria versus Zendikar. There's very different just styles to their biology. And it would be nice to see fairies kind of get that treatment, to see another exploration.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or email any questions, comments, or concerns to goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to support your friendly neighborhood gobslugs, you can do so at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. This episode of Goblin Lore was hosted by Hobbes Q, who you can find on Twitter at Hobbes Q. This episode was written and co-hosted by Alex Newman, who you can find on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. Engineering, editing, and production for this episode by Joe Redemann, who you can find on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn. Our music is by Wintergatten, who you can find at wintergatten.com. That's wintergatan.com. Logo by Stephen Raphael on Twitter at Stephen Raffle. Goblin Lore is a presentation of Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at hipstersofthecoast.com or at hipstersmtg on Twitter. Thank you all for listening. And remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.